what are you discussing as you walk along? With these words, the risen Jesus begins this encounter with those two disciples on that road to Emmaus. It takes place on that first Easter Sunday. This event that is in Luke's gospel is the latest that we're hearing at Sunday Mass during this Easter season of the appearance of the risen Jesus to his disciples. And as we heard on Easter Sunday, as we heard last Sunday, Divine Mercy Sunday, and we hear also today, that initial response of those disciples is not that of amens and hallelujahs. It's a response of fear, confusion, disbelief, disillusionment even. So unexpected is the resurrection that the disciples at first cannot believe it. Think of Mary Magdalene, Peter, John, Thomas, and now Cleopas and this other disciple. Also unexpected is the relentless pursuit of the risen Jesus to encounter these disciples. He meets them in their confusion, in their fear, in their disappointment, in their disbelief, to reveal the truth of the resurrection. And it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. To Mary Magdalene, Jesus calls her by name. To Thomas, Jesus invites him to touch his wounds. And now, with these two disciples on the way to Emmaus, Jesus begins by asking, what are you discussing along the way? Not recognizing it is Jesus speaking to them, they reply by asking their own question about him not knowing what's happening these last few days. And perhaps it's easy to imagine Cleopas rolling his eyes when Jesus replies, what things? But the question is an invitation to encounter the truth of the resurrection. And Jesus accompanies them on that way to Emmaus. Also, by the way, this is an excellent guideline to how to evangelize. What are you discussing along the way? Jesus, in fact, is asking them, tell me your story. Tell me what's going on. Because notice, when they reply, notice that they've heard about what's happened earlier that morning. That after the crucifixion on Friday, the burial on this Sunday morning, women from their group have encountered an empty tomb, visions of angels, and reports that Jesus is alive. Others have gone to investigate, but Cleopas and the disciples, notice what they're not doing. They are not going themselves to the tomb. Instead, they've in effect turned their back on it. They've turned their backs on the news of the resurrection, literally. They've not stayed in Jerusalem, they're heading away from it. They're heading away from that empty tomb, and they're moving in the wrong direction. But it is there that they encounter the risen Christ. Such is God's relentless pursuit of us. Now, in so many ways, these two disciples represent us. Because today, many have heard about Jesus. They've heard about the resurrection. They've heard about the cross. And those who profess to be Christians of all sorts of varieties say that they believe in the truth of the physical resurrection. The real question then, are we living that truth of the resurrection in our own lives? Are we seeking not only to avoid sin, but to grow in the virtue, especially that of faith, hope, and charity, these virtues that lead us directly to God? How often have we heard about Jesus? We've heard about the resurrection, but we turn our back on it by the way we choose to live. We go in the wrong direction. But even there, Jesus accompanies us. Much like Thomas, whom we heard of last Sunday, the disciples on the road to Emmaus not only turned their backs on the resurrection, they've also separated themselves from their fellow disciples. Jerusalem, should we see it as an image of the church. And those who choose to separate from the community of believers, what we know as the church, When one does this, one is also choosing to separate, perhaps not fully realizing it, but that community, they're separating themselves also, but the community believes what it holds dear, how it lives. That includes the scriptures, the sacraments, and seeking to live virtue and seek holiness just among others. As with the two disciples on the way to Emmaus, those who have separated themselves from the community of believers, there's disappointment. There has been, maybe the causes for it has been disappointment, there's been disillusionment, there's been pain inflicted upon them, maybe by members of that community, including leaders of that community. And that causes them to head off in the wrong direction. But even then, the risen Christ accompanies us in that relentless pursuit. He seeks to reveal to us the depth of that divine mercy and love. He seeks to set our hearts on fire with this mercy and love, which reaches its consummation in the breaking of the bread, in the gift of the Eucharist. The inner life of God is revealed to us and given to us in the Eucharist. It's at this moment that the two disciples who have been headed in the wrong direction, they recognize Jesus, just as surely as did Mary Magdalene, as Thomas, as did Peter. In recent years, many have moved away from the gift of the Eucharist, perhaps out of disbelief, indifference, disappointment, disillusionment, perhaps in pain and anger. In doing so, they've also moved away from the many other truths of the Gospels. But even now, the risen Christ accompanies them and often does so through us. And it's best then to take our cue from Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Instead of telling someone how wrong they are, ask them instead to tell them their story. Ask them, in effect, what are they discussing along the way? And listen to their reply. And it may well include an eye roll or two from perhaps as Cleopas does. And their story may well include disappointment, fear, confusion, pain, disbelief, and anger. And also along that road to Emmaus, as we listen to the story, it may be a lot longer than just 7 miles. It may take a long time, and that's part of accompaniment. And we also must do more than listen. There is to a point in which we must share our story of faith. We must share the goodness, beauty, and truth of the Gospels. That story may well include the times in which someone else has brought us to the truth. Even in our own pain, our own disillusionment, our own anger, our own fear, our own confusion. That's what St. Peter's doing in this first reading of the Acts of the Apostles. This is the preaching at Pentecost. He shares the story of what has happened with the risen Christ. That's what he's also doing in the letter that we hear today that bears his name from the New Testament. And Peter does this because that's what Jesus did. Peter seeks to evangelize people to the gospel, not simply to win the argument. It means not only sharing facts and knowledge, but also to set hearts on fire with the love of the risen Christ. For the risen Christ, out of love, relentlessly pursues us. It's the same risen Christ who walks with us when we move in the wrong direction, to unite us with the truth of the resurrection, and in turn commissions us as His church to walk with others so that they can also recognize that Jesus, the breaking of the bread. For notice that after those two disciples, they recognize Jesus in Emmaus, what do? They go back to Jerusalem. They reunite with their fellow disciples, and they share the joy of what has happened. For they have recognized Jesus, the breaking of the bread, as we are called to do the same today from this very altar.